it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Mounds, Invasive Species by Bear64. Calvin delved into the soft earth in the flower beds that he and his wife had made after they'd settled into their new home. Doris was at work. They only had one day off together each week, and a day each to themselves while the other worked. It was a nice arrangement. The rest of the time they were home together or both at work. As he considered how content they were, or at least how content he was, he felt a sharp sting register on his wrist. He pulled back his hand from the rich dirt even as he felt second and third bites along the back of his hand. Ouch! Nasty little... He trowed off, understanding the futility of cursing the little red insects. Fire ants possessed a nasty bite or sting, whichever it was that they did, and there was simply no escaping them. They were, after all, simply defending what they perceived to be their territory. He set aside his tools and stood to examine the ground. Sure enough, they'd begun a miniature mound town on the edging material for the beds. Not much of it showed, but he knew that it was more likely extensive below the surface. He couldn't stop himself from scratching the welts that soon rose. He brushed at his hand and arm to remove any other attackers he may have failed to detect. He used the garden hose to wash off his hand and wrist. Cool water felt good, though the itching and burning returned immediately after he shut off the flow. The burning sensations from the stings demonstrated how the creatures had earned the fire part of their moniker. He retrieved a bag of what was advertised as mound killer from the garden shed and spread a liberal amount on the mound. He followed the instructions and watered in the grains of the substance with a sprinkle from the hose. I got more fire ants. The loud ejaculation caused his heart to leap into his throat for a moment. His neighbor, Tanner James, no relation to Jesse, the elderly man stated upon each introduction or mention of his last name, stood just behind him. You know, as long as you're careful, you can use diesel fuel for the same purpose. Nobody'll complain, since nobody pays much attention. We ain't exactly a high-dollar district where people get nosy. Except them homos at the HOA. He cackled as though he'd spoken some great and humorous wisdom. Calvin shrugged internally. I guess he has to entertain himself, with his wife parked in front of the TV all day. Never mind who he offends. Well, Tanner, I have this stuff and I think it may work. I noticed that you have several dead mounds around your yard. I wonder why the bare dirt was tinted that bluish color. That from the diesel? Tanner grinned, yellow teeth glistening in the morning sun. It was already getting hot that day. It is. When you get tired of spending all that moolah on fancy store-bought stuff, just get you a yellow can and drown them in oily fuel. Dead mounds leave bare spots no matter what. So what if they turn a little blue? Been noticing lots of mounds this year. Wet spring. Looks like a hot summer already. Bad combo when it comes to fire ants. Mosquitoes too. Bugs like things wet, then hot. He let that sentence hang for a moment, apparently so that Calvin could cringe. Just like an old gal. He cackled more loudly now than ever, clapped Calvin on the shoulder, and then returned to his own yard. I really need to install a fence, Calvin groused quietly. His small wound still burned. He checked them again. The inflamed wounds had already sprouted little white pustules on their crowns. He knew that if he popped them, they might become sores, yet if he didn't, they would definitely become sores, despite the medical advice he'd found online after previous stings. Yep, definitely stings, he recalled. They latch on with a bite, then inject venom. Bastards. He decided that he'd had enough for the day and went inside. He'd check on the mound after lunch to make sure no creepy crawlers had escaped his wrath. Oh, I'm sorry you got boo-boos, honey boy. Doris kissed her husband's hand and wrist near the ant bites. Ooh, not on them. Gross. She shivered internally. Just went for you because you're so sweet. We can work on the plant bed tomorrow if you want. Maybe we just do some shopping and see how we feel. Calvin smiled. Thank you for the healing kisses. I know the bites are gross. They'll eventually turn into sores. Maybe. Never know. Oh, by the way, it's sugar ants that go for sweets. These red monsters go for flesh. He paused for a moment, hoping he hadn't spoiled her unusually ebullient mood. Then, just to ensure he avoided a whiplash from her emotional roller coaster, he agreed with her. Yeah, shopping tomorrow. And if you feel like it and the weather stays nice, some outside work. I checked and the mound killer stuff did the trick. Nothing left but those little white pellets, the eggs. He rolled his eyes. Oh, and Tanner suggested using diesel fuel to kill him. Not sure how that man is still alive. He's so sloppy about things. Sometimes a little dangerous. Doris snorted. Got me. I just hope he doesn't burn down the neighborhood. If his old house and all the junk in the yard caught fire, the entire block would burn to a cinder. Tanner, Esmeralda screeched from her recliner. Bring me a cold drink when you get done in the kitchen. Tanner shuffled into the living room and set a cold can of soda water on the tray next to his wife of 33 years. He knew she shouldn't drink so much of the sugary substance, but hearing her whine and gripe was worse than watching her feet swell from the diabetes. She glared up at him as he passed. What? Not even going to put it in a glass with some ice? Tanner sighed and shuffled back into the kitchen. As he awaited the chipped ice to spray from the dispenser, he felt a stinging sensation on his bare foot. He looked down and saw a little dark figure scrunched in effort on top of his foot. He grunted and used his other foot to partially crush the assailant and dispose of it at the same time. It let go and fell to the floor to twitch in an attempt to stand and walk on its remaining limbs. I must have carried that one in from when I was in the yard, he mumbled. He carried the glass back into the living room and set it beside the soft drink can. He ignored Essie's continued glare. It may have derived from her failing sight as much as from one of her vile moods at the loss of her physical abilities. So, watching same old? He again dodged the glare, but not the seething tone in her voice. Yeah, you know I like to find out what's happening on my shows. These are about real people, you know. This is the big finale episode. We find out who the father is and who Brittany's gonna marry. Oh, I like that tall, handsome guy. Duh. Tanner interrupted with a yelp and instinctively slapped at his leg. He rubbed the spot through his pants and then slapped at it again in a slightly different spot. What's the matter, Tan? Her tone and demeanor had shifted, though she continued to stare ahead at the screen rather than look to see the problem for herself. He grumbled in low tones for a moment, as if asking himself the same question. He came to a conclusion. Oh, I think I got ants in my pants. He continued to slap and scratch, then stood and scrabbled at the back side of his breeches. Essie smirked, her mood finally lightening. You got ants in your pants on the other side of France, where the men drink their beer and the women show their... Oh, shut it, will ya? Her husband barked. This really hurts. I gotta get him off me. He then scurried into the bathroom and peeled off his trousers. He spotted at several figures that crawled all over his exposed skin in attempts to find new territory to assail. Even as he batted and scrubbed at his bare flesh with one hand, he fumbled with the controls to get the water flowing in the tub. He paused to allow the warm water to reach the faucet, then pulled the activator to the shower. He nearly broke off the knob when what felt like a particularly large specimen of anthood chomped him in a very sensitive place. He grunted and caught himself before he slapped those... Well, he dropped his drawers and retrieved the squirming little monstrosity from the left side bulge in his scrotum. Gotcha! Well, the ant was actually no bigger than its fellows. It had merely gotten in a bite or sting in a delicate set of nerves. He rubbed his fingers together to crush the diminutive perverts. Well, that didn't always work. Fire ants were tough to kill, absent of a poisonous substance, but he ensured that this one's carapace crumbled. He snapped his fingers towards the toilet. I know you little turds can swim, but not when you're crushed and flushed. He followed words with action, and soon his nemesis was swirling toward the septic system. By then, he'd received a few more bite stings, too close to sensitive areas. He plunged himself into the shower and began to scrub vigorously. He continued until long after all the petite soldiers were washed into the drain. He kept the water running to ensure that they didn't climb back up inside of the pipe, and because he received so little respite from the stings, it felt for all the world as though the bites he already had were fresh and continuing. Eventually, his fingers pruned, he shut off the water and rummaged for a clean towel. Out of curiosity, he counted the stings. 18, wow, new personal record. Calvin opened his shed and then picked up the extra-large bag of mound killer to deposit inside. He flicked the light switch so he could see what he was doing in the dim interior. Nothing happened. Well, naturally, he flicked it several more times, and nothing continued to happen. Ah, great. He rolled his eyes, then set the heavy bag on the floor and went to check the breaker. The breaker indicated that there was power flowing into the structure. He flipped it off and back on anyway. He returned to the shed and found that the switch still did not produce light as he wished. Light bulb, he exclaimed, and snapped his fingers. He returned to the house and rummaged for a fresh light bulb, one of the old incandescent types. He remembered to take along his little emergency flashlight so that he could avoid stumbling over items on the floor of the shed. On the way back, he felt several odd little bites on his ankles and lower legs. As he reached the doorway to the shed, the stings began. Tiny scarlet warriors injected toxin alkaloid venom, solenopsin. He'd found the name on a search engine. He quickly set down the items in his hands and began to brush and scrub at the irritated wounds under his work pants and in the low socks he liked to wear with his light shoes this time of year. He eventually put a stop to each of the fiery, itching spots, at least a stop to the injections. The burning sensations continued. He picked up his items and quickly entered the structure and switched out the light bulbs. He returned to the doorway and once again flicked the switch. It stubbornly refused to activate his light. He cursed as he felt a fresh round of wounds inflicted on his feet and ankles. He shone the little flashlight toward the floor. It was swarming with fire ants. He allowed the beam to roll around the interior and spied large groups of the insects gathered on every surface near the ground and climbing upwards on others, even the fresh bag of mound killer that lay near his feet. As the fresh pain from the renewed, constant stinging drove him out of this place, he noted that the exposed wiring in the unfinished building had been chewed to pieces in several places. He read about that as well, but had forgotten that they like to chew on electrical wires. By the time he got the last of his attackers to stop, to flee or to die, he was in agony. His legs, from the knees down to his toes, were covered in welts. Doris put some calamine lotion on the bite and sting marks, but it did little to relieve his misery. His wife looked up towards his face, a worried expression on her own. "Babe, you got over 30 bites or whatever, just around your left ankle." She grasped his right foot and rotated it to an uncomfortable angle as she searched for more welts and pimples. "Only 25 I saw on the right ankle, but that's a lot. Lots of others on your legs." Calvin nodded. "I know. I don't feel so good." He felt the sinking sensation in his esophagus and the heavy feel at the base of his throat that indicated he would vomit. He extracted himself from his wife's rough examination and made it to the bathroom. Doris didn't go in after him. They had established early in their marriage that she didn't do puking. When he was done, he washed his face and found that he was sweating profusely and was short of breath. How many stings would it take to cause a serious reaction? He asked himself. He then managed to stumble back to the couch and sprawl before he lost consciousness. He never even heard the siren from the ambulance Doris had decided to summon, nor felt the sensations on the ride to the emergency room. I sure hope Calvin will be okay soon. Mrs. Butterfield patted at Doris's arm. She was a nice elderly lady who lived across the street and one over from Calvin and Doris, with her daughter and 2 teen grandchildren. Her daughter was away on a short stretch at the county jail. Routine misdemeanors. No currently charged felonies. Poor thing will be a great-grandmother soon, Doris thought. The way that granddaughter sluts around, just like her mother. Aloud, she gave the standard, appropriate response, though. Oh, they're just keeping him a day or two because he got short of breath. I scheduled an exterminator to come over this afternoon. That backyard has too many fire ants for just mound killer pellets. The elderly lady nodded. Yes, they're worse than I've seen them. Kyle picked up several stings just the other day. Oh, nasty welts. Now I have no excuses left to get him outdoors and away from those video games even for a little while. She glanced up at the sky. Oh, that exterminator may have to wait a day or two. Looks like it'll rain soon. Well, the exterminator beat the rain. He informed Doris that as long as he beat the rain by half an hour, the treatments would wipe out all of the mounds. He looked woefully around the yard once he completed the treatment. He lifted his cap and scratched at his balding scalp. It's a shame we can't tolerate fire ants. They voraciously consume populations of fleas, ticks, termites, cockroaches, chinch bugs, mosquito eggs and larvae, scorpions, all kinds of other pesky insects. If they didn't have that sting, they'd be quite useful. Then again, they wouldn't be able to kill and eat all those other bugs without the venom. Besides, some people claim that they're an invasive species. I think they're just migrating, looking for greener pastures. Well, thank you, sir. Doris used the pause in the man's otherwise non-stop lecture on fire ants to complete their transaction and get him on his way. She'd heard from the doctor that Calvin would be home in the morning. When the first fat, cold drops of rain fell, she decided that it wouldn't be a good idea to drive all the way to the hospital tonight for a visit. He'd keep until the morning. She wanted the rest. The exterminator's treatment had had nearly an hour to work before the serious rain arrived. The deluge that followed washed ants and poison alike around the yard and out into the drains and adjacent properties. It was a good night to stay indoors. Chanel spread her towel in the backyard of her grandmother's home. The grass was already looking a little sere and brown, but she couldn't get to the beach anytime soon, with summer high school occupying the first few weeks of summer break. I wouldn't do that if I were you, her younger brother Kyle warned in his most ominous tones. I got stung like all over the other day. Made me kind of sick. Chanel wanted to ignore the little pest, but knew that he would continue with his admonitions until she put a firm stop to it. Learning disabled. He's just like dumbass. He makes me kind of sick. She glared and sent the nasty thoughts in his direction, to no avail. He continued to stand and stare from the open sliding glass door, mouth agape and shoulders slumped. I don't plan on digging under junk in the yard like you. Besides, I already checked. Nothing under my beach towel but dirt and yellow grass. Go back inside and play your stupid games. Kyle blinked several times, then shuffled back towards his room and his computer. He was soon lost to the boring real world as artificial sound effects blasted through his headphones. Meanwhile, his sister stretched luxuriantly on her anterior, soaking up the warm rays of Sol Invictus, while her mind wandered over the wasteland that was her adolescent life. Oh, with Grandma. Internal eye roll. She drifted into a light doze, dreams of escape to more urban environs and a freer existence. Well, her dreamscape included slightly altered images of videos she'd watched, while beat music thrummed in the background of her senses. A heavy bass thump added a thrilling sense of danger. The swaying dancers, who sported suggestive clothing and waved firearms menacingly, added to the joy. Fire sprang from nearby trash cans, mere set pieces to give the video, Dream, interesting lighting effects. The flames leapt into the air at first, then started to trail along the ground and engulf her legs and buttocks, then her lower back. She turned and thrashed, and they licked up her body along her stomach to her breasts. A spark landed, and she sat up in distress. When she rose, she expected the sensations to cease, yet they remained all too real. She brushed at herself and looked in horror to witness what appeared to be hundreds of dark little figures, each with a hint of red in its coloring, and all swarming over her body, front and back, with no regard for her personal privacy. Each one stung at least twice, several of them more times. Chanel screeched and ran into the house, yelling for help. She ran past her brother's room, where he perched, oblivious to all but the game in which he was currently engaged. The one that to him seemed so much more interesting than mere life experiences. She ran to her grandmother's room. "She ain't here," the girl wailed, and she bolted for Grandma Butterfield's bathroom, all the while scratching and batting at her envenomed flesh. She plopped into the tub and opened up the faucets to fall. She wasn't conscious to see that the fire ants merely floated away from her and attached themselves to their nearest fellows and eventually to the first available surface, and from there to clamber from the expanse of the tub and out into the house. Tanner flipped and flopped in his bed. He was running a fever. His dreams turned immediately to nightmares. The heat and flames he felt emanated from within rather than from attacks by external forces. Just as the searing agony reached a crescendo, the heat was doused, and he plunged into an icy chill that shocked his dream self so profoundly that it awakened him. His last thoughts in the dream state were that his screams seemed higher pitched than they should be, and came from a distance. Essie stared blankly at the TV screen before her. All original thoughts banished in place of the drivel that spewed forth from her shows. "Tanner!" she barked, but received no response. "Lazy ass," she grumbled. "Tanner, bring me a drink. My legs are swollen. I can't walk." Well, her legs were indeed swollen, a combination of illnesses that had begun with diabetes and had progressed due to her stubborn refusal to adjust her lifestyle and eating habits. Her mood had typically soured as her blood sugar rose. Now her lazy husband was ignoring her, or had gone to bed early. She felt a burning sting on her cankle. It wasn't as bad as the neuropathy sensations, but it was bad enough. She hadn't been outside for a couple of years, so she'd forgotten what an insect sting felt like. But she was quickly reminded as she experienced a series of them along both legs. She yelped and cursed and slapped at her thick, cellulite-engorged legs. In her distress, she switched on the lamp on the little table beside her. Her remaining instincts were to view her attackers to determine whether there was a way to thwart their advance, to stop the pain. She immediately noticed that the rug that covered the worn spot in the carpet at the foot of her recliner seemed to shift. Its pattern of multicolored concentric rings blurred with the movement of hundreds, maybe thousands, of carapace-covered forms. They seethed and writhed and crawled relentlessly towards her. Her pulse raced shallowly within her massive frame. She breathed rapidly but weakly. The pace and strength of her lungs matched to that of her heart. She finally managed a scream of agony and terror. She was trapped in her recliner. She normally remained ensconced on her queenly throne voluntarily, and could neither rise on her own nor walk more than necessary to make it to the bathroom and back. Now she couldn't even manage to get the chair to lean forward, to get the footrest to lower. Her already flaccid and atrophied muscles could not get the blood and oxygen necessary to function. The rest of her body grew as weak as her pulse and breathing. And on the fire ants marched, onto the yellowish hide of the big chair, and from there onto her copious flesh. Her screams grew weaker, and had all but ceased by the time Tanner stumbled into the room to check on his bride. "Essie!" he heard himself rasp. His throat was scratchy and swollen, and his eyes puffed. He clung to the open frame of the passage between the back rooms of the house and the living room. It was an older design, what he referred to as an ant farm, warren of rooms, closets, and hallway passages. He switched on the living room light. It flickered a little, having been barely used for some time. Essie preferred her lamp. The floor was covered with fire ants. They slithered and thumped along from several openings in the floor near the base of the recliner. They swarmed over the form of his wife, her features twisted into a grim expression that spoke of a fist clenching around her formerly beating heart. He couldn't help her, and so he stumbled toward the back door. Maybe one of the neighbors could help him. "Kyle!" The name elicited no reaction, but the firm grip on his shoulder startled the young teen to adrenaline-fueled alertness. It was his grandmother. He slumped, heart still thumping and senses heightened. "Kyle, where's your sister? I want to talk to the two of you." Kyle glared for an instant, all that he dared when faced with his sweet but indomitable grandmother, and then shrugged. "Dunno, Grandma. I haven't seen her for a while. She was out in the backyard laying on a towel." Mrs. Butterfield walked to the backsliding glass doors and peered into the yard. One door was left open, allowing the climate control in the house to strive to air condition the entire outdoors. There was a big beach towel, wadded and discarded on the back lawn, but no sign of Chanel. She shook her head and tottered down the hallway to see if the girl was in her room. Well, the door was unlocked for a change, so she unceremoniously opened it to catch the girl in whatever nefarious act she was assuredly completing. The room was empty. She proceeded to the master bedroom, hers, internally threatening the little beast if she'd gotten into her grandmother's personal items. Still no signs of the brat. Then she saw that the carpet that separated the bedroom from the tiled floor of the bathroom was wet. Through the partially open door, she could tell that water coated the interior floor. "Chanel, what are you doing in my bathroom?" she snapped. She drew closer and finally dared to look inside. Her granddaughter bobbed in the warm water as it slopped over the side of the tub. In the pool, several flotillas of fire ants had banded together to form their own naval assault force. Many had reached the carpeted area and had marched beyond the seeping fluid. She felt several stings on her ankles as she shut off the faucet and felt at the girl stretched in the tub. The water was still warm, but the girl was not. "Weird," Calvin exclaimed as Doris drove him toward their home. "Lots of neighbors out and about. You think they're here to greet me?" He gave a wan smile, and Doris rolled her eyes at his attempted humor. "Probably not. The next-door neighbors and the ones across from us were still and quiet when I left to get you." She craned her neck, as though she'd be able to see more through the windshield than it currently allowed. "Hey, that's an ambulance in front of the Butterfield place. I was just talking with her yesterday. Well, I see her and the grandson. Don't see Minnie Hope. Probably out walking the streets or in juvie next to her mommy, dearest." Calvin snorted lightly. "Oh, come on, babe, that ain't nice. Girl's just a teenager." It was an old discussion. Doris was convinced that Chanel was headed for a life of promiscuity and possibly the sex trade, interspersed with visits to the county jail or even state prison. Perhaps some drugs, a downward spiral. Calvin thought that the girl's acting out behavior was a phase brought on when her father deserted the family and her mother proved to be more in love with her addictions than her kids. Yet he could see that something worse than abandonment or imprisonment had clearly occurred. Yeah, looks like they're pretty shaken. Mrs. Butterfield looks terrible. The boy never did look right. Never gets outside, but well, now. He trailed off impotently, appalled at the expressions and demeanor of his neighbors on the worst day in their lives. Well, so far. Doris managed to squeeze past several vehicles and pedestrians and wedge their car into the driveway, spluttering expletives the entire time and wishing hate and destruction on the drivers who blocked the street and driveway. Too many people here, she informed her husband, who had observed the same without her assistance. Police, and look, those two have cameras. There's a couple of media trucks down the street. She turned off the engine and exited the car in a rush to go over and find out what had happened. Calvin slowly unfastened his safety belt. He shook his head and muttered, "Oh, hey, don't worry, babe. I just got out of the hospital, almost died, but hey, I'll manage. So glad you care more about me than idle gossip." He caught up to his dearly beloved spouse as Mrs. Butterfield clutched at her. "Oh, Doris, my Chanel, she's gone," the older woman sobbed. Calvin shook his head again. He wasn't that surprised about her death. Stuff happened. He was more shocked that Mrs. Butterfield had looked to Doris as a potential source of support. He knew his better half was as cold and uncaring as one of the ant queens in the Mounds, well, where Chanel was concerned. She projected a caring image to others, though, and may have actually liked Mrs. Butterfield as much as she did anyone. Kyle simply stared at the pavement beneath his feet and tried to hide the fact that he'd had his phone out chatting with his buddies. He'd had to log out of his desktop before he could let his friends online know what had happened. Now he was getting return messages, most doubting the veracity of his tale of sudden, non-pixelated fantasy death. Calvin looked all around for a particular figure. "Hey, where's Tanner? He has to be eating this up." He'd asked the question to the ether rather than anyone in particular. However, another neighbor responded. "Ain't seen the old man all day. Think maybe he or his old lady is sick." Calvin couldn't recall the man's first name. His last was Diaz, maybe Carlos, Charles, Charlie, whatever. He nodded in acknowledgement that the man had heard and attempted to answer his inquiry. "I'm going to go check on them," he, for no reason in particular, informed his neighbor. Mr. Diaz nodded and made to go with him. They soon found themselves ringing the doorbell and knocking for the Jameses. There was no answer, so Calvin went around to try and peek inside a window or the back glass door. The interior of the home was dark and there seemed to be no power. It possessed a dead feel with no hum of life or light. He made his way around to the back door and felt his gorge rise at the sight that awaited him. Tanner was sprawled on the back patio. His body swarmed with an impossible number of crawling, biting, stinging insects. He knew there was nothing he could do but summon the EMS crew. After he was done heaving up the nice breakfast of hospital food, he shakily made his way back toward the front of the home. Diaz greeted him halfway. "Man, you don't look so pretty good. What a—" Calvin interrupted him. "Tanner's dead. Fire ants all over him. Oh, his corpse, anyway. Couldn't get close. Gotta tell EMS." Diaz was a quick study and nodded. He helped Calvin along and they soon had official assistance. Calvin wondered vacantly what the police officers who escorted the EMS workers were supposed to do about an enormous swarm of ants. It's not like they could shoot or tase them. Handcuffs and batons would definitely be useless. Even animal control would have to pass on this one. Nets and cages were insufficient to hold the tiny terror posed by the fire ant colonies. "Turn on the water," he heard someone call in the backyard. "We'll have to hose them off so we can get to him. Hey, someone go around front and check on the wife." Presently, an officer and a medic rounded the far corner of the house and approached the front door. Neither Calvin nor Diaz had tried to open the door. They were good enough neighbors that they wouldn't have been so intrusive. Besides, they each privately suspected that Tanner had guns in the house and would shoot anyone he perceived as an intruder before he asked any questions. The door was unlocked, and the officer entered first. She took a few steps and then bolted back over the threshold. "She's in there, but the whole place is crawling, filled with ants. We need some help. I'll get animal control, maybe the fire department with the big hoses." And then she began to slap at her lower legs, clearly distressed. "I can't believe it. We lost 3 neighbors in one day. All the bugs." Calvin sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. Doris hovered about, making lunch as they reviewed the events of the day. It was past nightfall, and the bodies had at least been carted away from the area. "It took the exterminators all afternoon to kill enough of those fire ants so the first responders could get to the bodies." He shuddered at the memory of the ravaged carcass that had been his neighbor, Tanner. "Good thing they had enough of those biohazard suits to go around. I doubt anyone could withstand the stink of that poison. Who knows what they'd be breathing?" Doris dourly dismissed his concerns for the police, fire, and EMS personnel. "What about what we're breathing? I can smell that junk even now. I don't know if it's in my sinuses or really here in the house. Either way, it gives me a headache. I think we should sue somebody." Calvin ensured that she did not observe him as he shook his head. "Don't know who to sue. The city, homeowners association. Maybe the people that hired the exterminator. The exterminator? The chemical company. The fire ants?" Doris slammed her hands onto the table and mercilessly jarred the headache Calvin already sported. "I don't care," she stated emphatically. "I want some money out of somebody. They put us all through this, and they need to pay." Calvin knew he couldn't apply reason to the discussion. The pronouns had just attacked under the leadership of the ominous General They. Maybe we can talk to a lawyer. This stuff has been in the news all evening. Maybe some ambulance chaser will contact us. On that note, he rose and made his way to the living room to catch the latest updates on the TV. He knew that Mrs. Butterfield was staying at a hotel. The James family had been notified of the tragedy that had befallen their elder relatives. People who lived in the Blaze Hill Villas subdivision knew what had happened. They had been plagued by the invasive species for a long time, and this year had promised to be the worst ever. Calvin wondered whether the reporters had gotten the cause of death statements from the medical examiner. Surely someone would have blabbed. When the report finally cued, he turned up the volume. "While officials have not yet released the causes of death in the Blaze Hill Villas fatality incidents, our correspondents have managed to contact some of the residents who have theories of their own. Yenny Sanchez-Diaz. Yeah, like my husband, he was there at one of them places. He said that there was like ants all over the place, like fire ants. They couldn't get close. And they brought in some exterminators, looked like something off that Alien Hunter show. Don't know what killed them. The people. I think that the ants were just, eating the bodies. It was, nasty, There you have it. This person's partner had a first-hand look at the scene. We expect that there will be a further press release in the morning once the scene has been cleared for investigators. And the reports moved on to larger tragic events in the world at large. Calvin sighed. I guess that sums up the lives of 3 human beings. His mumble was interrupted by the tones of an incoming call. He dug out his device and after several swipes got the thing to answer. "Hello, this is Calvin." The voice on the other end proved to be that of another neighbor, the one who lived up the next street near the apex of Blaze Hill Villas. Calvin, my friend, this is Namala Harik of the HOA. We're convening a special meeting of the HOA members to address the tragedies from earlier. We're concerned that there's some sort of toxin or perhaps a human-caused danger to our residents. We'd like you and your significant other to come. It'll be at my place. We have enough room around the pool to accommodate those who will show. Calvin knew that Namala had called him because he regularly attended these meetings. Most of the neighbors ignored them. Doris had never been to one. Of course, what day and time? He collected the necessary details and carried the message to the general, to Doris. To his shock and dismay, she agreed to come along. She wanted to give the HOA board a piece of her mind. Well, Calvin only hoped that she wouldn't drop it on them from a great height. Somebody might be crushed. So we've agreed in principle to arrange a mass extermination program in the entire subdivision, and we'll take bids for a contractor, yes? Harik was always one to be sure, especially when the meeting was attended by a large and interested audience. There was a general buzz of what sounded like affirmations, and a few raised voices that spoke of action, and he felt pleased that his initial and only reasonable suggestion met with general approval. He had nothing else to offer in any case. By the end of the next working day, every employee in the locally owned Six Leg Solutions was hard at work searching for and destroying ant mounds of every kind in the Blaze Hill Villas compound. At noon, Mr. Kara, the owner, approached Namala and the other officers of the HOA and smiled ingratiatingly. "I'm afraid we've run short of solution. There are more mounds than we anticipated. We have more on order and, well, frankly, shipping was slower than we expected. I'm going back to the office shortly and I'll do everything in my ability to rush the shipment. I'll explain that it's an emergency." Namala Harik assumed an offended expression. "But you promised to end this problem today. We have a contract." Kara nodded. "Yes, please, but this infection is on a far grander scale than anything we've ever encountered. I've been doing this for over 20 years, and I've never found so many nests. No company would have enough poison on hand to address such a large-scale challenge. I promise we will get the job done, even if we have to postpone other contracts." Well, Harik was still unsatisfied. He had a crisis on his hands. He wanted to maintain his position as president of the HOA. He had the biggest house and the most money. He lived highest on the hill, and he felt that he should have the position based on those virtues alone. And yet, in this absurd place, people insisted on elections, so he'd have to please them for a time. "I suppose we'll have to wait for you to get your solution," he spat, and then brushed his hands together to wash away the conflict. "You should not have taken on the contract when you knew you were short. For now, continue, but we will wish to know by mid-morning tomorrow whether you have enough product to complete your task. And if not, we will hire a better company." Kara nodded. "Fair enough, but I'll warn you. My first idea was to ask around to borrow from one of the other companies. No one had any. Every exterminator in the city is working overtime. We may be all that's available." Even while Mr. Kara explained the deficiencies of his company, one of his exterminator team members was still at work with her last bit of solution. She was in Calvin and Doris's backyard, near the flower beds. They were both at work, but everyone had signed permission forms to allow the exterminators to enter their property to destroy the insectoid scourge. Siobhan had planned her route carefully so that she could get near the houses where the two old folks and the teen girl had died. She fancied herself as a crime scene investigator, maybe a lab technician, and thought she'd be able to solve the investigation if she could get close enough. The other yards were surrounded by crime scene tape and signs that included dire warnings for anyone who trespassed on the scene without official authorization. As she worked her way along the flower bed, sidling her way toward the Jameses' property line, she felt the ground grown spongy. The crust of bare dirt gave way several times, and she nearly stumbled. Yet she was intent on catching a good, lurid view of the other yard. She felt her leg then plunge into a deep hole, like one left by a rotted tree. Her other leg wrenched painfully for a moment before it descended to follow the first. Siobhan quickly found herself trapped up to her ample waist. And then the bites and stings of aggravated defenders of the mound set her to screaming. There were tens of thousands of them on her in moments. She screamed and called for help in an increasingly attenuated voice, finally trailing off into, "Oh lordy, oh lordy, oh lordy." As Siobhan's pleas went unanswered in the mortal realm, Leroy Dabka paced his yard, mumbling to himself and occasionally cursing the exterminators for failing to reach his property before their noon break. He was unaware that the break would be longer than a lunch hour, and assumed that they would make their way up to his home sometime in the afternoon. He was high on the hill, with the other folks who could afford pools. He had expected to have his property addressed soonest. He rarely entered the grassy knoll that rose beyond his pool area and marked the high point of Blaze Hill. He'd noted the browning of the grass, but chalked it up to a looming drought. Such things did not normally concern him, yet it meant a depreciation in the value of his home. Lazy, low priority. His grousing matched his pacing exactly, an odd parody of a song and dance. On the last chorus, he extended the routine by a few paces, and found himself knee-deep in a quagmire near his pool. He hadn't recognized that the ground was wet in that space, clearly from some minor leak that had had time to build a subterranean quicksand pit. He had no way to know that the ground had been further weakened by a multitude of tiny tunnels, food storage and egg cradle holes. His curses and calls for damnation on every personage he could recall resounded through the green space and echoed out across the water that was rarely disturbed by an actual swimmer. He clawed his way from the muck and mire as he felt the stings begin. He knew that he was under some form of assault by thousands of stingers. Somewhere in his subconscious, he recalled that if a swarm of bees attacked, one should plunge into any available body of water. Well, these sensations were definitely stings, so he crawled and then stumbled the last few paces to the water and plunged into the sparkling light blue relief. Well, it worked for a moment. The waters were cool and soothing. But then the stings resumed. He surfaced and swam toward the deep end. He wore only shorts and a golf shirt, and his sandals were somewhere still in the mud, being attacked by minuscule pincers and envenomed stingers. He reached the deepest part of the pool and dove. He stayed down longer than he'd ever done previously, and swatted at every hint of movement on his flesh. Many of the wee warriors fled and floated to the surface, and Leroy soon joined them, and he spluttered and heaved in great breaths. He looked around in hope that the swarm would have dissipated, or the individual members of it drowned. Instead, there was a carpet of small red bodies on the water. They clung to one another and floated, a coast guard for the colony. And they soon sank the battleship Debka. By late afternoon, virtually everyone in the Blaze Hill Villas neighborhood was gathered in Namala Harik's pool area. Please, the exterminator called and said that they've received some more solution and will return shortly. They're taking care of the problem. We must remain calm. It was the wrong thing to say to people who were afraid and working themselves up into a frenzy of anger that would supplant the embarrassing feelings of fear that had brought them together on this hot afternoon. Doris, ever a firebrand when it suited her mood, gave voice, a loud voice, to what was on most minds. What's happening? We've had people disappear. We've had people stung and put in the hospital. Why is this happening? What are you doing about it? What's in the poison? Calvin hunkered beside his wife, who now stood in front of one of the few available chairs. He watched the faces around him as they flushed or darkened with rising ire. He looked further back to the fringes of the crowd. Even the people along the fence at the rear of the gathering seemed to froth with anger. They milled, and shouts arose. It soon registered that they were not shouts of fury, but of terror and pain. Calvin stretched to his best height, then gave up and clambered onto the chair. Doris gave him a scorching look at the feel of his hand on her shoulder, when he placed it there to steady himself. Why are you interrupting? finally dawned on her that something was wrong. She changed her line of questioning slightly. "What are you doing? What's going on back there?" But Calvin didn't answer. He stood stock still and watched in dread as rows and then waves of his neighbors disappeared from view. The collapse picked up pace, and he soon found himself plunged into darkness. The falling sensation had been brief, and his momentum was arrested somewhat by the dirt that fell with him. He felt a crushing weight on his abdomen and found it hard to breathe. The weight turned to a sharp thrust from Doris's elbow as she tried to use him for support so that she could rise. Dirt still rained on around them, and the muffled screams of the dying penetrated to their space in the new Blaze Hill Villa's mound. Well, another wonderful story from the ever-excellent Michael G. Lockhart. Thanks again for sharing such a fantastic piece of work with me. Really enjoyed that one, and I hope you all did just as much as I did. Well, yeah, ants. Don't think little things like that can cause so much pain and death. Well, let me tell you, during the summer I got bitten or stung by something really nasty. I was out in the local woods collecting some wood for a barbecue, and I went through this little hole in a fence, got to the other side and reached down to pick something up, a bit of wood, and bang! The pain was unbelievable. It's like burning, fiery pain instantly, like within half a second. I looked, couldn't see what it was, but I thought, well, I'm in a bit of trouble here. I'm in the middle of the woods. I've got stung by something that really, really hurts, and I've got to get out of here, just in case it, something bad happens. And I had this tiny little hole in the fence to get through, and as I was trying to climb through it, boom, stung again, twice more. I thought, well, I am really in trouble now, so I had to, get out of there in a hurry, climb over a couple of fences and run away. Things, could have got really nasty. So, yeah, moral of that story is don't be an idiot and go and collect firewood in the middle of the woods. And failing that, have respect for nature, no matter how small it might seem. Well, that's my advice for the evening. I'll be back again pretty soon. Maybe tomorrow night even. Not quite sure. Till next time, my dear friends. Sweet dreams and bye-bye.